All right, welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're jumping headfirst into a real scholarly showdown. At the center of it is one of history's most debated questions. What is the actual evidence for a historical Jesus? But we're not just looking at the evidence. We're looking at a blistering critique of how that evidence gets handled, or, as one scholar argues, completely mishandled. So let's set the stage. In one corner, you've got Bart Ehrman. He's a huge name, a distinguished professor, a best-selling author, and he argues that, yes, Jesus absolutely existed. And in the other corner, the late Hermann Detering, a German theologian and a key figure in what's known as the radical critique school. And these are scholars who are, let's just say, not afraid to question everything about early Christian texts. And boy, did he write a scathing review of Ehrman's work. So what we're doing here is breaking down the arguments from that very review. It's titled Bart Ehrman and the Non-Christian Sources. And yeah, you heard that right. Ehrman. It's a point-by-point takedown of the case Ehrman makes in his big book, Did Jesus Exist? Detering comes out swinging. He opens his review with this quote from the Roman poet Horace. It's like saying, you've made this huge, dramatic presentation promising mountains of evidence, but what you've actually brought forth is, well, a tiny, ridiculous mouse. It sets an incredibly confrontational tone for the whole thing. Now, you might think Detering would jump right into the historical sources, right? But nope. His first target is actually how Ehrman frames the entire debate. He takes issue with how Ehrman positions himself and his opponents before a single piece of evidence is even on the table.
So Detering zooms in on what he sees as this major contradiction. On one hand, Ehrman positions himself as this dispassionate agnostic, no skin in the game. But then, in an NPR interview, he talks about modeling his own life on the teachings of Jesus. For Detering, this raises a huge question about Ehrman's claim of pure objectivity.
And according to Detering, Ehrman paints this picture that's, well, it's almost a caricature. On one side, you have the decorated professor, gleaming with academic titles. And on the other side, this vague, shadowy breed of mythicists, these aggressive amateurs who aren't real scholars. Detering argues this is just a rhetorical trick to dismiss the opposition from the start. And this really gets to the heart of Detering's complaint. He's asking, since when is historical truth decided by a majority vote? He makes the point that pretty much every revolutionary idea in history started out on the margins, usually against bitter resistance from the establishment. Truth, he's saying, isn't a popularity contest. Okay, so now we're getting into the real meat of the argument. We've talked about the framing, now let's talk about the evidence itself, starting with those non-Christian Roman sources that Ehrman leans on so heavily. First up is this famous letter from Plenny the Younger, a Roman governor. For Ehrman, this is a huge deal. It's an independent, non-Christian source talking about people who worshipped a guy named Christ as a god. Seems like pretty solid proof, right? Well, not so fast. Detering comes back and says this letter is just full of holes. He raises a bunch of red flags. For instance, why would a seasoned jurist like Plenny need to write to the emperor for tutoring on how to handle a court case? Or what about this weird detail of forcing Christians to curse Christ? Detering cranks out that's more of a Jewish custom, not really something you'd expect in a Roman court. These are the kinds of oddities that make him seriously doubt the letter is authentic. And this quote from Detering just says it all, doesn't it? If you don't know any problems, the world is all right for you. His point is that Ehrman's certainty only works if you just, well, ignore all the tricky questions scholars have been debating about this letter for centuries. All right, so if Plenny is shaky, what about the big one? The famous Roman historian Tacitus. He wrote about the Great Fire of Rome and claimed Emperor Nero blamed it on a group whose founder, Christ, was executed by Pontius Pilate. For Ehrman, this is a slam dunk. Case closed. An independent Roman confirming the core story. But Detering looks at this and says, hold on a second. What if Tacitus never wrote this at all? He argues it feels like a later Christian scribe just popped it into the text, centuries after the fact. And this is where it gets really cool. Detering does what you could call literary forensics. He says, look at the text. The paragraphs before this section on the Christians are all about Nero's big rebuilding projects in Rome. Then, bam, you get this paragraph about persecuting Christians, and then the very next word is inter rea, meanwhile. And we're right back to talking about how Nero is funding those same building projects. It just doesn't flow. It's like a clumsy cut in a movie, suggesting the Christian part was awkwardly spliced in later. And again, for Detering, this is the key. He's not even saying Ehrman has to be convinced by this argument. His point is, you can't just ignore it. A serious scholar writing a definitive book on the topic has to at least acknowledge and deal with major, long-standing counterarguments like this one. Okay, buckle up, because now we're heading into what might be the most debated territory of all, the passages from the first-century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. So first up is a line that on the surface looks like a smoking gun. Josephus talks about the execution of James, the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ. I mean, that seems pretty direct, right? A known historical figure, James, tied directly to Jesus. But Detering throws a wrench in the works. He points out that just a few lines later, Josephus mentions another guy named Jesus, son of Damnaeus. So Detering's theory is that the original text was talking about that Jesus' brother, and a later Christian scribe saw an opportunity and just scribbled in the crucial phrase, the so-called Christ, to make it about their guy. And now, the big one, the main event, the Testimonium Flavianum. This is a whole paragraph in Josephus describing Jesus as a miracle worker and maybe even the resurrected Messiah. Pretty much every scholar, including Ehrman, agrees that parts of it are obvious Christian additions. The real debate is about what, if anything, is original. So Ehrman takes the popular approach. You just surgically remove the over-the-top Christian bits, and what's left is a plausible, neutral core that Josephus could have written. Sounds reasonable. But this is where Detering brings in the big guns, citing work from Ken Olson, who, get this, was Ehrman's own former student. Olson argues that if you try to restore the passage, the whole thing falls apart. For example, if you take out "he was the Christ," then why does the text say the tribe of Christians was named after him? It makes no sense. The so-called original parts are basically incoherent without the Christian parts holding them together. And man, this leads to what is probably the sharpest, most personal jab in the whole review. Detering basically says, hey, Professor Ehrman, it's not enough to know your students. You should probably read what they write too. Ouch. He's accusing Ehrman of completely overlooking critical, relevant work coming from his own camp on this very topic. So after walking us through this point-by-point takedown of Ehrman's key non-Christian sources, what's Deering's final verdict? Where does he land on the case made in Did Jesus Exist? Well, the verdict is absolutely scathing. He paints this picture of an absent-minded professor who was in such a rush to get the book out that he just forgot his promise to actually deal with the tough counter-arguments. He's basically saying this isn't a serious scholarly work. It's a quick, superficial dismissal of difficult questions. You know, at the end of the day, this whole scholarly showdown is about so much more than just these two guys or these few ancient texts. It's about how we do history. What counts as good evidence? What level of certainty is even possible? It really forces us to ask a tough question. When the historical record is this murky, when all we have are these faint whispers, how do we decide which story is the right one to fill in the gaps?